Agapiti fili cari meri cari spera apoto rentmant che calo sietate seena coma.net API review.
Beautiful.
To say, I have no idea how I really did there because, yes, I'm going to say it. It's all Greek to me.
I understood it.
Aw.
So congrats.
Would you believe I've
I hope
had
we
that?
just promised that we do some amazing JSON features in .NET 10. Is that what you said?
That's gonna remain a secret between me and Jeremy and the
And
Greek viewers of the stream,
zero
I
point
guess.
0.3 other Greek watchers.
I've had that script up so long and practiced it so much, expecting to deliver it, that I actually didn't need it anymore.
Ooh.
I was just like I've been like walking around the house randomly reciting it. I know
By
what
the
some
way,
of the
if
words mean now.
anybody's watching live right now, you're doing it wrong. You should watch .NET Conf. This is just a bunch of us reviewing APIs. It's not that interesting. Plus, it's recorded, so you can watch it later.
Yeah, what he said.
Well, I mean, .NET 9 is in the past. Like we're talking about the future. .NET 10.
That's true. It's past 10 o'clock. .NET
It's
9
true.
now
It's already
exists.
legacy code.
Yeah, .NET 9 has now existed for 11 minutes. So, yay! All right. Um, it's enough being silly, I think, for now. All right. First up, unsafe accessor type attribute for static or private type access 90081. What?
I don't think Aaron is here, so does anybody have context on this? Otherwise, we can just skip it. I guess skipping it is.
Fair enough. Um, Moving on to apply overload resolution priority to span-based overloads 109549. Mr. Tobe.
So this ranges somewhere between nice to have and mandatory, depending on exactly how the language on language decisions that are made. The and it's also not, we're not changing API signatures. This is just about adding the overload resolution priority attribute that we shipped in .NET 9 to a bunch of attributes, to a bunch of APIs. The result of which is it causes, by saying -1, it causes the compiler to deprioritize these overloads compared to other overloads that it finds sort of in the same level of grouping. And in this particular case, these are all of the overloads that we added to be extensions on span, where we also have overloads to be extensions on read-only span. And the only reason we added the overloads for span in the first place was because span and read-only span aren't first-class citizens in C# until C# 14 or C# 13 under the preview flag. And that meant that if you had a span and you dotted off of it, you wouldn't see any of the extension methods that were only on read-only span because they're logically considered different types without a relationship between them. So we exposed these such that if you had a span, you could still do the read-only span stuff without having to first cast. The downside to having, so now with C# 14, these span-based overloads are basically useless. Best case, if someone does call them, they all just redirect. They're just a one-line delegations to the read-only span equivalent. If you call one of these things, it just delegates, but in doing so, you're putting a little more pressure on the JIT because it has to inline it to get good perf, and hopefully it does. But if the JIT hit one of its inlining budgets, then maybe it wouldn't even get inlined. Also, we end up possibly with a slightly larger binary size because you're calling these APIs, so the trimmer needs to keep them around. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is right now, the way the language is defined, if you have an array and you dot off the array, you will see these extension methods thanks to the first-class span support, but it will pick the span-based overload, not the read-only span-based overload, because of how overload priority works, span is implicitly convertible to span. So the way the language is defined right now, it sort of sees a, a derivation relationship between them almost. And so it thinks that span is the more specific type, and so it binds to that, which is problematic because of array covariance. So if you had uh, an array strongly typed as object array, but it was actually a string array, when you call object array.binary search, it will blow up with an exception because span's constructor has a covariance check to make sure that the T is actually matching the actual type of the elements.
Right.
So we really want these calls to bind to the read-only span, which doesn't have that check. Now, there's a conversation currently happening about these language rules, and there's a proposal out to change the way that this works to special case to prefer read-only span over span in these situations. Regardless of whether that goes ahead, I think we should apply this attribute. But if that doesn't go ahead, we definitely need this attribute, because otherwise anyone with a covariant array who tries to call one of these will get an exception.
So I have one question. So why wouldn't we just remove those APIs from the reference assembly?
We can do that too. The purpose of overload resolution priority is to not have to play such tricks. I mean, that's one of the reasons we have it in the first place.
So I could be entirely wrong, but my guess based on the normal language rules is if you have a local that is a span of T and you call binary search, overload resolution priority is not going to kick in because an exact match is going to win. So a span will still call this and not the
No,
read-only.
with overload resolution priority, the exact match will not win.
Okay.
You'll go to read-only span.
I thought it was a lower tiebreaker.
The other thing though, Emo, is if we remove these from the reference assembly, other languages that don't have this span read-only span support would no longer have the span-based overloads.
The reason why I'm proposing this is just noise, right? So, I mean, maybe we should just, I don't know, find other ways to hide it in docs, for example, because it's, yeah, less is more, right? In this case.
I mean, we can editor browser will never then.
Well, I mean, that's one thing. I'm thinking docs in particular, right? If you look at the docs page, you see like 4 overloads, and realistically, you only care about one of them. Like, that's kind of why I was saying maybe we should just collapse it down.
But if I don't have I mean, if we hide them in the reference assembly, that means anyone who wanted to use these from another language wouldn't. That didn't support sort of the implicit forwarding to read-only span would break. I don't know if that's a null set or if, you know.
I mean, in VB, it's very close to the null set, so we can probably not care. I don't know about F# because it kind of has support for spans. But yeah. Other question I had is overload resolution priority is not just like, it seems like we always use -1. Is that intentional?
So it's purely a numerical system. The default is 0. So if you want to deprioritize something, and you're not trying to order multiple things, you're just trying to order it relative to something else, any negative value would suffice.
Gotcha.
Are you asking, should we be using basic jump by 10 just in case rules there, Emma?
No, I'm just kind of, I'm mostly curious about how we reason about them. I mean, I kind of like using -1 everywhere because, as Steven said, the problem is once you start trying to order, that's when, then you want to have the basic like jump by 10 so that you have some slots to fill in, I guess. But presumably that's not a breaking change to change the number, because what really is important is the order that the compiler sees, not the actual numeric.
And it's also not relevant across different types. So we can change these every time we ship the assembly because we're not competing against other applications of this and other assemblies.
Cool. I see. Well, I mean, really, like, what about exception methods? Are they not collapsed into one set?
No.
So how does this work then? When you have extension methods on two types, the compiler picks which type to use first, and then within that type it resolves?
That's my understanding. Or it's an ambiguity error.
Huh.
Tanner, if he remembers differently, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was an explicit discussion about whether this would help with two disparate set of it, and I believe the answer is no.
Correct. It was intentionally designed so that if there's ambiguities, the ambiguities continue existing regardless of overload resolution priority. Overload resolution priority only works within a given type,
Interesting.
just to keep overload resolution sensible.
Well, I like that.
And to
because also
avoid
means-
the ability for two different types from different libraries being able to basically compete with each other and constantly do, oh, I'm -1 next release. Oh no, now I'm -2, or
Yeah.
the other way if you want to be better.
Yeah, that also means that our decisions are always local. I like that. We only have to reason about this in the context of one type. I mean, I don't have any problems with the proposal. To me, I just want to make sure that we at least consider just removing it because it does seem like it's the easier fix. But yeah, I understand the implication for other languages. And maybe we can work with the docs team to somehow, I don't know, find a creative way to hide them by default.
So, given these are extension methods and the extension method resolution is weird with overload resolution priority, is adding these ever a breaking change that we need to think about?
I mean, yes. I mean, you're deliberately changing which overload is being called. So
Yeah, but that we're saying that you won't, like, you would see that in IL, but we're saying you wouldn't see a runtime behavior. But was this going to introduce a compile failure if somebody has similar extension methods when it wouldn't have already been a compile failure?
No.
Okay.
I mean,
It's possible. It's possible. So if you had a span, you would end up in one of these binary search overloads. If by adding overload priority -1, you'll end up in the read-only span. If somebody else had an ambiguity, exposed an extension method for read-only span that was ambiguous with the read-only span overload, such that if someone was already using read-only span, it would be an ambiguity error. By adding overload priority to -1, you're forcing their use of span to also be read-only span. They will then hit that ambiguity error because of that conflict.
Would that be the same as if we deleted the span-based overload?
There's no difference there between overload resolution priority and removing it from the reference assembly.
Okay, but if we had the span and read-only span and somebody else put an extension method on array, it's now going to see that an array could go to the array one, a deprioritized span one, and a read-only and a read-only span one. Is that not going to get upset because it's across two classes and one of them uses overload resolution priority?
Well, array is convertible to both span and read-only span, so I don't see how that would.
So I'm just trying to understand what the rules are with overload resolution priority on extension methods split across multiple classes, and when that's
irrelevant.
When that's a warning and when that's not.
It's irrelevant across multiple classes in terms of how the compiler picks between them. It can affect how the compiler, which overloads the compiler sees as being most applicable as part of, from a given type.
Okay.
I mean, my understanding is basically the compiler will pick the best overload for each extension type, and then it will overload resolve between the different extension types. So if you have an array, and one person defines an extension method against an array, and on our side we only have one with span and read-only span, then according to this rule, the read-only span would be the better one. But you still have to resolve between the read-only span and the array one, and my expectation is the array one would win.
Correct.
So
Okay.
that would mean I don't think this is going to break anybody, but if it does, I guess my stance would be that is what happens with extensions. It's like we can't be in a business where we don't add extensions because it might break someone, or change our own over resolution rules between the ones we have. Like that seems
The
that's what
only
my
case I'm
view.
aware of, and it's possible there are others, but the only case I'm aware of where this could introduce an ambiguity error where there wasn't one is the case that I outlined earlier. If someone else had binary search, a binary search extension on read-only span, the exact same signature that we have. So there's already an ambiguity between our read-only span overload and their read-only span overload. But someone was calling binary search on a span.
Yeah, we would pick this.
Today, that would just bind to our binary search on span and there wouldn't be an ambiguity. By putting overload resolution priority on the span one, basically removing it, now the one that it picks from our type would be the read-only span one, which is ambiguous with the other read-only span one, and that will then introduce an error. But that's the only case I'm aware of.
And that one in my book is the same problem that I said earlier. It's like somebody is competing with inbox extension methods.
Yeah.
And we basically said we don't care because otherwise we can't really do things anymore.
Yeah, if it's not going to cause a problem across them trying to write their own extension method that was intercepting the array and converting it down to the read-only span,
Right.
then I don't know that we've slapped this on anything before, and if we have, it wasn't on a lot of things. So it's just making sure that we're not that this isn't a new category of breaking change that we're not already thinking about. And
Right.
I agree that there is a corner case, but it doesn't seem like it's a thing that we need to think a lot about.
I mean, I think there's sort of two issues. One would be the case that we inappropriately apply it. We have, or rather, we have two overloads that behave differently, and we apply this attribute to one of them. The other one gets picked, and all of a sudden, the caller recompiles and they get different behavior. But that was the problem. There wasn't applying overload resolution priority. The problem there was exposing two overloads that behave differently. Which we just shouldn't do. Then the other one is the case of that we were just talking about, which is basically the same case as we add a new method and it competes with someone's extension method, and now they prefer our method instead, or they get an ambiguity error, and that's just doing business.
Yep. I can't think of anything where we would have a method named like trim end that would have different behavior across overloads. That'd be absurd.
Yeah, the closest I can. The only reason it's on my mind is I was having a conversation yesterday about the dictionary. What's it called? The dictionary expressions that are likely to hopefully show up in C# 14. Like collection expressions, but for dictionaries. And there's an active conversation about what is the behavior of a dictionary expression? Is it if you have multiple elements with the same key, is it exception or is it overwrite? And the leaning preference there is overwrite, but that then leads to, just like we have the collection builder attributes that we can put on our collections, that's going to probably require us to expose some APIs in the libraries with overwrite semantics, assuming that's where it lands. And we'd have to be very careful that we're not doing that as overloads of APIs that have exception semantics, which is the majority that we have today. So that's just why I was thinking about it.
But for dictionary, that would just be use the indexer instead of the add.
Right, but a bulk method like a create range.
Yeah.
Like so immutable dictionary.create range today that takes an IEnumerable has exception semantics on duplicate. And if we were to add a create range that took a read-only span that had overwrite semantics on duplicate, that would be concerning, I think.
Yeah.
But that would be the situation here, where if we then deprioritized one over the other, like that would that would be, changing behavior in a consumer application.
Why is immutable array create and vector constructor? Why would they have already overloaded span and read only span? Because we're dumb, or what? These are the only two things in
Um,
your list that aren't extension methods.
I don't remember.
Because
Uh,
neither of them look like they should have ever taken a span.
um,
You probably just missed that, would be my guess.
I mean, Vector does have an API a constructor that takes a read-only span and a constructor that takes a span. I don't know why.
Okay. Here are no objections.
Is overload resolution priority tied to Langor?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either. I remember there being a big discussion over it, and I don't remember where it landed.
What's your concern there, Emo?
I'm just trying to reason about what happens when you multi-target and you don't upgrade Langor.
I mean, at least for these, the worst case would just be that you. Well, I guess the worst case would be you're using the array and you hit the covariance bug, or the covariance block. The second worst case is you keep a method alive that walks through the conversion of your array into a span and then span into a read-only span. So it's better if you can drop them out, but like we intentionally shipped them so that they would work. So
Yeah, so for the immutable array one, presumably we would have the attribute locally defined and put it in the OOB as well.
Yeah, as internal, yeah.
Yeah. So then, so that basically means if you compile against the OOB, then if you don't upgrade the Langor, you might get different behavior. But I guess that's just the way things are.
I mean, it shouldn't be observably different behavior. You could look at the binary and see you were calling a different method.
But yeah, that's true. It's more the example that you gave earlier, right? When you call the create one with a span, and you pass in an object array, one would fail, one would succeed, right? But yeah.
Sure. Yeah, but that's a question of, that's like, anytime we remove an exception from somewhere, if you target the older one, you still get the exception. If you target the new one, yay, it's gone.
Yeah, it's more like when you start off with targeting net 7 or whatever, or net 8 or net 9, right? And then later on you add the net standard one, and then the same code compiles, but it blows up. That might be surprising, but that's just, that's always the case when you multi-target. I think that's fine.
yeah, and in the case of the constructor that I don't know why it existed in the first place, it does the obvious thing.
I'm
I
pretty
honestly
sure
think
that
we just did it for consistency, but there's no reason why we should have done it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it must have been one of the earliest things because you shouldn't take a writable span unless you're going to write to it.
Yeah.
Or you're an extension method. But now we don't want them for extension methods anyway. So. Unless they're going to write to it.
So the feature that they do is only specific for spans, right? So it's not a generic. If you have implicit conversions, you don't have to define different overloads, right? It's only for span because they're special cases.
It's making span a first-class citizen in C#.
Yeah.
And gaining all the stuff that comes along with that, just like arrays are first-class citizens.
Yeah.
Okay. think Aaron's with us now.
Aaron.
So
Oh,
so we can jump back to unsafe accessor type attribute for static or private type access 90081.
great. So the general problem here is unsafe accessors require an implicit piece of knowledge, and that is the type in which you would like to access. You can imagine the scenario where if you look at that like private type, what we currently do is the first argument for forget constructors. Constructors are, we'll deal with that in a minute. But any function that you would like to call on a type, the first argument represents the target type in which you would like to look it up. So for example, list of T, you want to access a private field, you put in the list of T where that C is.
Right.
And so we know, inspect this type for private information. That's how it works. But what if the entire type is hidden because of reasons?
Right.
And so that is what we're like, how do you express this concept and describe it? You can imagine the same thing for the constructor. In the constructor scenario, we just look at the return type for the type that you want to create, and that's how it is created if a constructor is private. So the first scenario here, the first issue here is if you would like to access a private type, how do you spell that name, speak that name? The other scenario that this is actually involved in is static types. So for example, console, if there is a private member on console, you can't actually supply or speak the type itself. You couldn't say console C, because Roslyn compiler immediately will say, nope, this is a static type, you cannot have an instance. And so that's the other scenario where you just can't do anything. You can't speak the name in an instance scenario, so you can't even tell unsafe accessors what type to look at. And so this particular attribute is saying, or providing a mechanism by which we speak the type in a way that makes sense. So that's its whole purpose. Speaking types, so just looking them up and trying to access them. And those are three scenarios, and then the proposal is very straightforward. It is literally just a attribute with a string. And that string is going to conceptually be passed to type.getType. It takes a string. And that will return you a type, and that becomes the target of the operation. Or the argument to a type. So you can imagine if your type is private, perhaps some of the types that it uses are private. So how do you describe those as well? So this is just, you're just doing the exact same thing. And the format, we're not creating any new DISL. There's no magic here. We're not investing in any scenario that doesn't currently work with type.getType. So we just need a string placed someplace.
Can I ask why you chose to make scenario 3 and 2 encoded differently?
Sorry.
Or I should say scenario 1, 2, and 3 differently? Like, why wouldn't you always put the unsafe accessor type attribute on the parameter?
I'm sorry. I did not update those examples. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Those are, sorry, this is always, these attributes are on the parameter or on the return. That is where they are. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that makes sense now.
I did not update those examples. I'm sorry about that.
Gotcha. So then, yeah, okay, then they're all uniform. Okay, now it makes total sense to me, yeah.
Sorry about that. Yep, I will. I can kind of play with that.
So when would it go on a method? Because you left method in the target group.
Probably never, right? Only on the parameter or the return, right?
Right. It would only ever go on the returner or the parameter. Right.
So we should remove method from the target group.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't update the examples. Sorry about that. That's my bad.
You messed up, AA1.
Listen, nobody's more upset about it than I am, I assure you.
I just wanted to use that line. So remind me again, what's the use case for unsafe accessor in general? Is it just for better perf?
It is for better perf. That is a huge example. There's a huge issue. The other one is native AOT.
So basically doing reflection without doing reflection.
Right.
And then when we do this encoding thing where you basically pass it in as object, but you say, hey, it's actually this other type, this has no perf implications, it's just
Right. Okay, so now we can talk I can talk about like the current planned level of support for this. This is going to happen in a couple different over a couple different releases. You're not going to get everything immediately. So right now, and if you look at the bottom of this, there's a few proposals from people for other things, but I have yet to understand the utility that they're providing. The idea currently would be if you have an unsafe type, or if you have a type that you cannot speak, and it's a reference type, you use object. It's free. It's just an object. You're going to be able to always describe a reference type as an object.
right.
And so that's the easy case. The not so easy case are value types and ByRef-like types. ByRef-like types are going to be a whole other set of problems that I'm not even sure we're ever going to be able to solve. But it's possible. But the current plan would be once we address some of the issues with typed reference, ByRef-like types or value types would not be represented by an object. They would be represented by a typed reference. And that is not a scenario that we currently would implement, or I would currently implement in V1. The V1 scenario would literally block on any scenario that did not request a reference type. So that would be the .NET. Depending on funding and time, it would be for .NET 10, it would only support reference types. So you couldn't specify, for example, let's say span was private, you never would be able, well, that's a bad example, but GUID, you would never be able to speak GUID in this particular scenario. The runtime would say, this is a value type you're requesting. We do not support this at present. And the primary stakeholder for this particular feature is EF.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that a lot of this work has come down. The impetus for a lot of this was EF.
Is that for things like people have private setters on their domain objects and they want to be able to set them from EF?
EF a lot of the code gen for EF is private.
Yeah.
And because they use reflection historically, that made them incompatible with native AOT.
Yeah.
Now, you're absolutely right. This thing has been used to much fanfare by various people. I think even Stephen Tobe uses it in a bunch of places. There's a lot of wins for this because it turns reflection to almost zero. There's a little bit of cost on the JIT side because we have to generate some stuff, but at runtime, it just doesn't. It's literally zero cost. Especially all of these generated accessors, if you were, they're all designed to be immediately inlined because they're so small. They're not really very interesting, and so by default they just get inlined. So there's very little cost.
What happens if you mess up? Are we AVing or?
No, it mess up in the sense of like if you ask for something that isn't there.
Yeah, like as in like you're basically trying to call a method that has a different signature. Are we just AVing, or are we saying sorry that thing is not valid?
It is identical to the reflection scenario where it would say you've asked for something that does not exist. We are
Okay,
very strict about that. Yeah.
so
So
it's
it's
still
basically
technically type safe or memory
yeah,
safe. It's just yeah, it might not work at one time. Yeah.
So it's a
right.
missing
So
member exception.
right, it's missing member or missing field, any of those things, and
Yeah.
and in uh, in this type scenario, it would we might actually create have a I don't even know what exception was. I'd love to hear it. If there's one, what exception should I throw? Type not found. I don't know if that exists. Uh,
Sounds right.
does type not found exist?
I think it's there's an overload to get type that isn't allowed to return null. I think it throws type not found exception.
Okay.
And then one last question. So in the example encoding of the assembly, uh, so are these components all required, or can I leave off version and culture?
So that was my I was cheating there. It is whatever get type it gives you. It is the format that type.get type expects. So if you're in an environment at which you don't need to specify the assembly, sounds great, don't specify it. But I am literally just going to pass it to that, and it is going to operate in that context.
Sweet. So literally anything goes from that syntax.
Yeah, exactly. Like whatever that syntax goes, that is what we are going to use to find the type, and it will give me a type instance, and it'll give me the type that we need to operate on, and I will at the runtime will inspect it and interrogate it as you would imagine, and that's just what we get. We're not trying to do anything clever here. As you can imagine, we had some questions about what is the scenario where we want reflection. Oh, not reflection, generics. So if you have list of T that is private, how do you specify T? And it's like type.get name does not type.get type doesn't support that, so we don't support that. We're not creating a new intermediate new DISL here. We're just relying on the existing logic for finding a type, or existing mechanisms we have for finding a type.
There's no string you can pass to type to get list of a private type. I thought it was system.list backtick one, like open curly brace, name of private type, close curly brace.
It's not curlies, it's like brackets, but yes.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah,
I was pretty sure it wasn't angle brackets. So
let me rephrase that. That's a fully instantiated type. You can't have a generic type. You can't have like a T.
Oh, an open
generic.
generic.
Okay, open
An
generics.
open generic, yes, like a non-instantiated type.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Yes,
Yeah.
you can whatever it takes. We'll accept that.
Right.
But I'm not. If we're not supporting like, well, the calling function has a T. I want to flow that through.
Right.
Like, no, we're not.
I mean,
we're not.
You can't pull them off. Yeah,
I think type.get type will return an open generic. I guess type of can get an open generic. I don't know if type.get type can.
I don't think so, because I think type.get type gives you back a type that you're supposed to be able to activate. I don't think it can give you back an open generic.
Yeah. I mean, so there are a whole lot of exceptions that can come out of type.get type. If you're calling it at runtime, then they can all happen here unless you wrap them in something else. So type load is your name your name was legal, but I couldn't find a type. But then you get file not found for like
Yeah, and
this
and
one,
that's
if it can't load the assembly, you get argument exception if the input's malformed. That's less of an issue because it clearly has to be a literal, so a constant expression.
So when you say you call type.get type, like I think I had enough alcohol to forget all the semantics on which load context these things go into. So what happens when you use assembly load context and you call these things? Does that have any implications on which context we're looking in and all that gloriness?
It's going to. I need to. I think you can use I believe you can use the scoped ALC thing. I can't remember what it's called. There's a few APIs for reflection that allow you to define a scope, which ALC to look in for those APIs, because there is no place for the ALC in the API.
Right.
I can't remember what it's called. I'd have to ping Eleanor, or maybe someone on here knows exactly what the semantics are, but that would be the current expectation.
Right.
Yeah, for the ALCs, I think it will always use the ALC of the assembly that the unsafe accessor is in. I don't think anything else would work. So we need to know the kind of the resolving ALC at G time, and the cheating can happen on background threads or wherever, and there's no way for people to override it kind of in predictable way. So the only ALC that makes sense is the ALC of the referencing assembly, kind of the, the assembly that contains the unsafe the attribute.
Unless you already loaded it. Like a library could create its own load context and load the dependency it's about to call into, right?
Yes, it can, but still the resolution.
I'm gonna use that one. Yeah.
So let me say it differently. But it's like the custom attributes today allow you to refer to types, and the types are actually encoded as type name strings in metadata. So the resolution of this thing will work exactly the same way, I think.
All right. So I was going to ask, but looked up the answer, but I'll ask it anyway, so we see it here. Why this isn't just an extra property on unsafe accessor attribute, and I think it's because you want to distinguish between when it's applying to the return value and when it's applying to the first parameter.
Or all the other parameters.
Fair enough. But the fact that the attribute usage is different is why you want a different type.
I just updated the examples.
Yep. And then number 2, so you take the type name as a constructor parameter, which means the property should be get only.
Okay. So just get rid of the init.
Yep, that's just attribute design rules.
Okay.
All right. Anybody have anything else on it? Chat says type.get type can return open generics, so you'll just have to block that at runtime. All right.
Yeah, makes sense.
Binding runtime.
I guess we expect most of this usage to be in code that is being generated, right?
That was the original primary intent, and I think that still holds. As I said, we have seen several people in the community, and even in the runtime, we have a few niche areas where it actually is a benefit.
Yeah, I'm mostly asking because the string is a bit unwieldy, but if it's mostly generated, I don't care really, because you can trivially construct it when you have a generator and make sure it's correct, right? You don't have to.
Right, and it's the same problem. I mean, it's the same problem as reflection. So if you're going down the path of I'm replacing reflection with X, and I want to use unsafe I want to replace it with this now, you're going to basically be using the same information that you had.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Although in my Symfony use reflection, a lot of the stuff is just you basically get assembly as an entry point, or get calling assembly or type of assembly, and you walk it from there, so you don't really have to use strings usually, because you usually start with something strongly typed and then you just enumerate. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter. Like if it's mostly generated code, I'm okay with telling people you write out the string.
Yeah.
You want to call it big boy API, be a big boy.
Right, and so that's also, your point is very well taken. I think one of the experiences that I've had in working on this and working with bugs that have come up is all of the mechanics of it are, you can construct the scenario by just calling other APIs. And so users can easily say, I want to look at this string. What does type.get type return? Like that's literally what we're going to call. So I think there's just relying on the system. They do have a way to discover things that are and kind of debug their own process if they want.
Right. Yep, works for me.
Yes, we apparently have used it 3 times in runtime, so ignoring all the ones that say they're in something called tests. So.
Yeah, sadly, I actually used it in tests before. I was kind of grumpy about it at the time, but it was incredibly useful and way clearer than the reflection goo that I would have needed to write. It was just very easy.
So you hate love your own API? Is that what you're saying?
I really dislike this. I really dislike this API. I dislike it slightly less now.
Man, one day you will like the field keyword.
Yeah, I mean, so for functions, it's the same as doing creating a typed delegate and finding it from reflection and doing create type delegates and saving the pre-bind.
Yeah.
Fields is a little different because I don't think there's a good reflection way to bind a function over get field. You have to call get field, but yeah. So if you were going to write the reflection code, it's the same thing, but better type safety.
And the native AOT side has really been a big.
All right. Any final comments?
Going to be a banger API for .NET 10. I can tell you that already.
We'll see.
People will use the shit out of it.
Oh, they already do.
Exactly. But now they have more scenarios that they can fill in.
All right. Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Thank you, Johnny.
Memory extensions overloads with IA quality comparer. Really? 28934. That's. I would have expected.
You're questioning
older than
how old the issue is?
Yeah, it's the wrong number of digits.
Yeah, just kind of sit in the background. Oh, Levi is excited about this one. Okay. Yeah, so this has been sitting there for a while. It had reasonable reception initially, and then it just kind of sat there because we had discussed it and decided it was only about like 2 APIs, and there were actually a bunch more it could pertain to, and so someone would have to go do the legwork to figure out what it pertained to. So I went and did the legwork to figure out what it pertained to. Basically, a bunch of the APIs we have on memory extensions do searching or comparisons, but they work by constraining the T. So there's an index of that constrains T to be I equatable of T. But that then means that you can't use these helpful methods when you don't implement that interface, or you might implement it, but you're in a generic context where the T that you have isn't constrained, and then similarly you can't use it, at least not until we get some kind of support for bridging generic constraints, doing a type test somehow and then calling. So we already have a few APIs on memory extensions, a few overloads that have one overload that is constrained and another overload that takes a compare, like sequence equal. But we have a bunch more APIs that would benefit from it and don't, namely all the ones currently on the screen. So basically everything that you're looking at has an existing overload today that lacks the comparer at the end and has T constrained. And these overloads are it's the mechanical fix up of copy, paste, remove constraint, add comparer at the end. To everything on memory extensions that seemed relevant, with a couple exceptions. If you scroll down to my notes at the bottom there, right there, I didn't add any for trim start, trim end, because A, wasn't clear to me that it's actually needed. It seems like those are almost always used with strings, but also there are overloads for lots of different things: span, read-only span, memory, and it wasn't clear to me that it was, again, relevant in all those cases. And then also for split and split any, for similar reasons. It's also a little bit more complicated there. The split enumerable, we added constraints T, and we would have to figure out we basically have to introduce a new type that didn't have the constraint for overloads that lacked it. And I'm not hearing anyone asking for these overloads, so I left those off. Um, everything else I added, everything else on the type that's relevant shows up here.
Yep, and I was just thinking through that last point, which is if you call something with like with two parameters, including the this parameter, um, it will win out over anything that used a default parameter. So
Yeah. The only thing I need to think through, I need to actually try to see if we're actually introducing any ambiguities with our own stuff. For example, enumerable dot contains. I don't know if this will cause any. I don't think this will cause any problems with that, but we should, double check.
I think I missed the part, but why is the compare optional?
So that the same reason we have it optional everywhere, so that we use a quality compare of t dot default.
because it can build one. We have the technology.
I'll be back in a sec.
So
This is riveting watching around the hallway.
It's like I want to inform him about this new technology circa like 1998 that you can reserve a room.
Yeah, I should come to campus and at least give him some company. So question: does this impact the way that, say, floating point values are compared? I think Tanner's on the call, so I wonder if he might have some insight into this.
Sorry, I was not exactly paying attention here.
No, that's okay. So if you have right now, say that you have a read-only span of float, for instance,
Yeah.
and you call contains man or something like that. I don't know, some weird degenerate case, right? A, does that work today? And by define work how you will. And B, will it work going forward?
It won't change anything
So-
because it'll still call the overload that says span is or that float is I equatable.
Right.
Ah, yes.
So since floats I equatable and I comparable, and since that since that has an implementation that follows rules that are appropriate for use in a hash set or dictionary, it will continue and use, for example, the new that we added back in like .NET 6 or 7 system numerics, IEEE floating point total ordering comparer, whatever we named it. It was some really long name. And that follows the IEEE total ordering rules rather than the historical .NET ordering rules, where all names are created equal in the .NET rules, and the IEEE rules actually considers the payload for sorting as well.
Okay, so that shouldn't be a break then. Would passing null as the last parameter might be a compile time break, but it won't be a runtime break. And I'm going off of floats now. I'm just saying, like, if you had a nullable t and one of the values that you were looking for in your call to index of any was literally null, it seems like that would now be an ambiguous method call, unless we somehow annotated these with like, yeah, prefer the other one instead of this.
But why? Like if you called contain like some span dot contains null, that's still gonna bind based on the. Like if you pass a null, you're still at the previous formal parameter list.
I'm saying if you pass a null in the last argument
For comparer?
or something like for contains any. Say that contains any right now. You're calling you have a read-only span of string, for instance.
This one.
And you're saying contains any empty string string with maybe a single space, and then null. Now that would be ambiguous with the first row you have highlighted on the screen.
That is.
Why would it be
I
ambiguous?
think it will still call the one that takes value 0 through 2 because the rules for default. Basically, the rules for default parameters are pretend they don't exist. Can you find a target? And the answer would be yes. You would find the one that went up through value 2. So I don't think even if you wrote the literal word null or the literal word default without doing default of t, I don't think that would be a compile ambiguity with this.
I think it might be actually.
But
I'd be shocked
even if that wasn't the case, I'm not. If t has already been determined to be string, how could the last parameter being null?
Because if you just say null, then there's no type, right?
But there already is from the previous arguments.
That it can't tell if you're trying to call value 0, value 1, value 2, or value 0, value 1 comparer.
Right.
But I think it will because of the
I think
rules of
Jeremy's
default.
right, isn't it? It would only consider optional arguments if it can't find one with non-optional. Is that the case?
Yeah, that one I don't know.
Doesn't our whole strategy for versioning optional arguments, overloads with optional arguments, depend on that?
I mean, no, our versioning for that is mostly about the arity, right? And then the order. I think as soon as you have something like null, where you have effectively a target type scenario, you can still create ambiguities, right? And so you might have to cast that.
We can try it easily, very quickly.
Yeah. But I guess my question earlier is like, why did we default the comparer? Because it seems like if I leave it off, it will always bind to the existing methods, right?
Only if you're I-equatable. If you're not I-equatable, then you'll get the automatic default comparer.
If I have a t that is not constrained to be I-equatable, would we want to force someone to be compare? But even if it was non-optional, that wouldn't. If there was an ambiguity here, that wouldn't address it.
No, that's my question is completely orthogonal to the thing that Levi brought up. Yeah, that makes sense to me now. To have the optional comparer for the unconstrained generic.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not saying this is fatal to this or anything. It's just does it result in a compiler ambiguity error or not? Like, if so, then we just document it. Whatever.
Do we? I mean, do we even care about the individual t's now that we have collections expressions with the span one? Or contains any?
Sorry, I wasn't listening. I was just realizing that I think Jeremy and I were talking about a different case. If you explicitly provide a value for an optional parameter, it's no longer optional. At that point,
right.
Whether it was optional or not doesn't factor into overload resolution. So you would have an ambiguity if you pass null.
But if you pass in, if you say contains any with a string array, and then you pass in 3 null literals, how does the compiler pick between the second and the third?
I mean, hopefully no one does that, right? Because you're saying contains any null.
If you pass in 3 null literals, in that case, won't it? I think it will pick the second one, won't it?
Yeah, because because it is by arity, right? It has the right number of arguments, right. And it's applicable, yeah.
Yeah, for something like that, I was honestly a lot less concerned because that's like somebody literally passing a whole bunch of the same values, which all happen to be null, into index of any or contains any or whatever. And that seems like something no one's going to do in practice.
But the null one, your original example, Levi, that would require you to explicitly put a cast to differentiate,
Yeah.
to disambiguate.
Yeah, and maybe that means, and I haven't tested this, right? I'm not at a place where I can right now, but maybe we say this is a compile time breaking change, but it's for the greater good.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
wouldn't
the
you?
I think the only alternative, the only realistic alternative, is you don't allow someone to provide a compare, which is the whole purpose
Yeah.
of this API.
So yes, the literal null appears to confuse things.
So
Because at that point, it's not optional. It's you're passing a value for the argument.
I would have thought it would have hit this one because it was a formal parameter that needed to be hit, but I guess here it's you've specified an argument, so you've promoted it to formal.
Right, exactly. The optionality only factors in, I believe, when you don't specify it, and then the fact that it was optional factors into overload resolution.
Yeah. So if someone has created an I-equatable reference type, I guess it does. If they, yeah. So what we've said in the past is we care about null, but we care less about default. So if they have their own I-equatable thing and they put default in the last parameter for contains any multi, it will be ambiguous. If they put null, it requires they created an I-equatable reference type, which seems less common.
Null that requires an I-equatable reference type.
Because you can't say null if it's a value type. And the only ambiguity is when it's I-equatable. Because if I comment this out, it'll compile. It should compile. Oh, because I didn't constrain it. There we go. So, if something
Right,
isn't
it binds to the-
I-equatable,
Right.
it knows what the null means now. And if it is I-equatable and a reference type, then the word null becomes a problem. I guess, or a nullable value type. So yeah, we can call it a breaking change. The break's really minor.
I mean, this is one of those things where I think I'm okay with that.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I just wanted us to run through the exercise to see if it was a breaking change, and it sounds like, in this one really weird edge case, yes, but
Yeah.
okay, sure.
Though, Emo, I think you were asking, should we just drop the contains any overloads except for the one that takes span and make people write in the square brackets?
I mean, it seems would solve the problem, but also like, how much do we care, I guess, for that scenario to be 2 characters less? It always seems weird to me to have effectively params semantics, but then have a trailing argument that is of a different type.
So the thing that strikes me kind of odd there is the only time this is ever ambiguous is if you're passing literals, right? Because if you have a typed variable,
Yep.
then the type is known at compile time. That said, like if you have literals, why aren't you using search values of t?
Well,
I guess it would be if you had one literal and one
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, you could
Okay,
look for
that's
X,
fair.
Y, or null.
yeah.
Sure. Is that common enough?
I don't think no, I don't think so. But I mean, searching for null is already well, it happens, but it's specialized situations.
Yeah,
And it's
the
only
only time
it's
I ever
only the
really
null and default literals we're talking about here. This wouldn't happen with
Mhm.
any other kind of literal because any other kind of literal is a value type, right?
I think you're right, yeah. And I don't even know if does nullable of t even like get the interfaces for the underlying t, or is that like some weird magic under the covers?
It definitely happens at runtime. I don't know if it happens at compile time. I don't know if it happens at the C# layer.
Yeah, there is some sort of lifting. But I don't know if a nullable of an I-equatable is itself I-equatable.
Right. And if it's not, then this isn't ambiguous anyway, right? The to Steve's point, I think the only time I ever really see in practice somebody saying like, oh, here's a span of t, like look for null, is that they have actually typed the span of t as non-nullable t, and they just want to confirm that it really is before they keep operating on it.
Yeah, there's that case. There's a couple cases I've seen that I've done in the past as well, where I'll have some like collection, like a list of foo, and I want to get rid of a bunch of things from it. So I'll go and mark those elements as null, and then I'll use, list of t's remove where null, basically, and have it do it all in an order n
Right.
operation.
But the only ambiguity we'd have here is for the multi-value ones, which are going to be contains any where the last value was null.
Right.
So contains null totally. Contains any something and null feels less compelling. Meaning, I think we can. I think we can make the break.
Because to me, it's just you look for an arbitrary set of values, right? Whether that's null or not null. To me, that seems in the same.
No, it's whether it's the null literal in the last position.
I mean, if it's null, it's going to be a literal, right?
I mean, you can have a variable that evaluates to null.
Right, but if I look for particular values, chances are that a lot of them end up being literals, and so I think null to me is as likely as any other value in that regards.
Right, but again, it requires that you were calling it on contains any or contains any except, or any of the other any or any excepts, on a span, and you have a reference type that is I-equatable.
Yeah, to be clear,
and the null's in the last parameter.
On this being a breaking change, I also think it's an acceptable one.
Yeah.
I just think us talking ourselves into this, that is, that combination of things is super rare. I mean, I think to me it will happen to someone, but I think the fix is going to be relatively straightforward. I mean, if you look at IntelliSense, you see the overloads that are there. You cast the argument to what you want it to be, and then that's the end of that. To me, it's still just weird to have this params thing with a trailing argument. I'm not sure I'm a fan of that, but
so you want to drop
I think I would probably
like the middle
do
two.
I mean, what would happen if
three.
you would swap them? What if the comparer comes before the t's?
Then it's no longer optional.
That seems backward from how most other set operations are done now.
Presumably we have a contains any somewhere else that does the same thing, and we're just like, if this is an existing pattern, I don't think we should.
Yeah, if
Think
that's
about it too
true.
much.
I mean, yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, to me, it's just weird because params by definition is at the end for me, and then having trading optional seems odd. But like, I guess maybe that's just me.
Yeah. Though I actually don't see one, so it may be worth the debate. The only contains any excepts that I'm seeing are these, or rather this type.
What are they doing, by the way, Stephen? Are they just forwarding to the read-only span one, or are they actually doing something smart and optimized?
No, they can't forward. Wait, sorry, which ones are you talking about?
The ones that take the individual t's, are they forwarding to the read-only span one, or are they doing something smart?
They're doing something. They're doing something different. So the implementation already has dedicated overloads, dedicated implementations for 1 through 5 values, basically, because it vectorizes them. And I believe, I'd have to double check, but I believe the read-only span one special cases 1 through 5 and delegates to those specialized implementations, and then falls back to the more general one for more than 5.
So there's a profit if we
So,
were to drop them.
so the spam one calls these instead of the other way around.
Yeah, that's funny actually. Yeah, then. And if that's the case, I would keep it as is because it's a tuned API. It might be slightly out of the ordinary, but I think it's acceptable to tell people like, I think in practice, T is going to be very often a value type anyway, so I'm not sure how often you actually have the null problem.
Just wait until T itself implements high equality comparer of T.
You say things.
How would you do that?
Because I'm curiously recurring.
What will that even do?
I mean, that's already, I know you're joking, but that's going to be ambiguous today already with our existing APIs that take high equality comparer, right? Like the link ones.
Right, because with contains any, yeah, you'd either have to call the longest overload and hope we never add a longer one, or explicitly put the brackets to indicate that the last one was the comparer to use instead of the value to search for. Because once you lock this is the span of values, then the last argument forcibly becomes the comparer. Now, if we ever make read-only span be I equality comparer of itself, then this whole thing will fall apart. But let's just not do that. All right, so everything was I equality comparer except sequence compare to. Do we already have a sequence compare to?
We do.
Okay, and it's just I comparer.
T is constrained to I comparable of T.
Okay. Simply the one of these things doesn't look like the others. So.
Why does the sequence comparer use a comparer? Oh, because it returns an int.
It's
It's basically a string compare to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
Returns
chars,
the difference in the first position that had one, I assume.
I mean, makes sense.
This was me, what is it, squaring the circle, circling the square?
Squaring the circle, yeah.
Squaring the circle.
All right.
Circling the square is not that hard, actually, but
I don't remember off the top of my head which one will add more area. Curvy things are hard. All right, so as is.
Ship it.
Yeah, I'm too lazy to get rid of all the pluses. You want pretty code, don't submit it diff syntax.
I guess eventually I have to handle diff syntax in my tool.
Oh, fine, I'll fix it. This one's easy because we're not like the other one was putting attributes on things.
I know.
So that was harder to deal with, but I'll fix it real quick. Place all. All right. Add formatting support to server sent events 109.294.
Yeah, so this proposal comes after the introduction of system.net.serversend events as a NuGet package for .NET 9, so this got shipped basically today. This is a pretty small package that just implements the specification of server sent events. The issue is that in this package we only exposed parsing functionality, so being able to read server sent events as produced by a server, but we didn't actually incorporate any functionality for writing out server sent events if you are the server. So basically this proposes to just extend the APIs to cover that use case as well. This is something that has come up in the context of, for example, building AI agents. So effectively, this would involve us repurposing the existing struct, SSE item of t, adding one additional property, event ID, and also making the event type optional, which I suspect we'll be debating quite a bit about today. And other than that, it proposes we add a formatting delegate, which is kind of similar to the parsing delegate that we had for the existing APIs, and a formatter class that is similar to the SSE parser class that has already been shipped. So,
oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I thought you were done.
I'm mostly done.
Okay. So I have the same concerns that I raised on the post. In particular, this is forcing everything to be serialized to a byte array first, rather than going out to some buffer that we maintain.
So to that point, I've if you could scroll down, I've noted a few alternative designs for the delegates that don't have this issue. So one is just writing to a stream directly. Notably, this wouldn't be the same stream as the one that you're writing to. You'd need to intercept that because of SSE needing to handle line breaks, especially. But I think the closest approach to probably what you would want to achieve is using a NI buffer writer of byte, which would compose well both with stream and also with pipewriter, assuming we wanted to add support for pipewriter in the future. The only downside of that approach is that, well, it becomes harder to write that delegate. Like, rather than doing serialized bytes, you now actually need to wrap your buffer writer with a JSON writer. Not the end of the world, but I'm just pointing this out.
So your delegate, all of your proposed delegates here can be expressed in terms of func or action, which means our guidelines suggest you should not be creating a delegate type. So why are you creating a delegate type?
Just replicating what existed for the parsing side.
We added a new delegate for parsing?
Yeah, but I believe it has an out parameter. So.
Okay. That would be why it needs a custom type.
I do like the symmetry, even though, like you said, Jeremy, it is duplicative of what's already in func in action.
Well, but if we get rid of the delegate type, then we can just overload on different signatures of func in action, and you can do all of these.
Yeah, it doesn't have an out parameter. It has a read-only span parameter, which
used to be prohibited,
and it still is on .NET Framework.
True. But yeah, if this just uses if you don't introduce a type, then you don't have to name it across the three shapes, and you can just say this takes a T and sends it to bytes, or it takes a buffer writer and a T and it sends it into the buffer writer, or it takes a stream and a T and it sends it to the stream. Like you you gain easy overloading if you drop the custom delegate type.
I don't mind. So if we were to pick one, I'd probably just go for a func, sorry, an action that takes a buffer writer and a value.
If we overloaded, we would, with the same number of parameters, we'd force someone to specify types when providing their lambda.
So the arity, like across the stream, and the iBuffer writer would do it, but the arity difference between the initial proposed one and these would not.
Oh, where do we keep iBuffer writer in that standard? Is it system.buffers?
Was it called iBuffer writer?
Yeah.
On that
I
standard.
thought it was system memory. Is it buffers? I thought it was memory. No? I don't know.
It's the system buffers namespace, but
It's system memory.
okay. Yeah, the package already depends on that, so we're okay. But assuming that the delegate shape issue has been sorted, I just take you to the SSC formatter class. Effectively, this just mimics the shape of the SSC parser. It doesn't necessarily have to, but I decided that it makes sense mostly because you can create a formatter that just takes a source and takes a formatter, and then you can decide in which medium you want to write it to with separate methods. So that creates a nice separation that I'm preserving in this proposal, as well as in this case async and non-async writes to stream.
I'm trying to remember all the reasons that we ended up with the separation between SSC parser.create and then the methods on that. What would we lose in this case if it was just SSC formatter dot with static methods write to stream and write to stream async?
I don't think we'd be losing much. It would just be a combinatorial increase on the API surface as we add more things. So effectively, it would become a JSON serializer type of API, assuming that we added, pipe writer, stream, async, non-async variants, different types of delegates.
Right. So you're saying we'd have to add twice as many because we'd be adding both write to stream async overloads and write to stream overloads.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Pipe writer and whatever comes up in the future.
Why do we not want to have one where you can write them individually?
You mean write with each event? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because it seems like what this thing is doing is just a wait for each, and then whatever it has to do for each item. Why don't we just expose the method for each item, and then let the caller control and how they want to traverse it?
So the way SSC works is that individual items need to be formatted in a specific way. It also needs to handle line breaks in a specific way, and line breaks are significant with respect to the sequencing of events. I don't believe that we could meaningfully extract this to a per element API. We could, but I don't think it would be very useful.
And we don't think the caller wants to, I don't know, sort, order, filter.
No, no. And I mean, if they wanted to, they could act on the source async enumerable,
They
right?
do that as part of their own async enumerable. Like they provide the right input into this.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of have to then, because we don't really have link for async enumerable, right? So you have to do your own
Well, we
thingy for
do.
that.
We have system link async on NuGet. We just don't own it right now.
I guess, yeah.
So
There is a .NET 10 issue open assigned to me to investigate that, but yeah.
So the creates take an async enumerable but aren't async. So who's doing the async work? The write?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the synchronous write to stream doing? Sync over async?
It's just exercising the sync APIs of Stream.
No, but it also has to be enumerating the async enumerable.
Right. Yeah, that would necessarily do sync over async. So
yeah, but I don't even know how you. How would you?
I'd get
how would
rid
you
of that
name these?
overload. At some point, I think I had a variant that took an enumerable, and in that case, it made sense. But given that I've trimmed this down to async enumerable only, I think write to stream async is the only viable method that we.
I was also going to ask. We generally have that if you have an async thing, you should have a sync thing. So should we allow creating from a non-async enumerable? Because like if you know you're building 3, why are you making an async enumerable?
Well, the thing with SSE is that, generally speaking, if you've buffered everything, using SSE doesn't make a lot of sense. So we could. Would anybody need it?
This also goes back to if we're talking about getting rid of that last API there, the write to stream one, which doesn't make sense right now, then the concerns around an explosion of the full matrix of overloads no longer exist because there's only one operation being performed. And if there were multiple operations to be performed, because we had an I enumerable and an I async enumerable, presumably you would then still want an overload that specifically paired the input I enumerable with the sync writing to be done.
Yeah. I think you would want different types. You would have SSE async formatter and SSE formatter, because it seems weird to pass in an async enumerable and then, I don't know, blow up with an exception when you call the sync method, right?
Right. So at that point, I'm wondering, should these just be static one-shots? SSE formatter dot write to stream async. That takes
my only concern is that, well, I mean, you avoid an allocation obviously, but it does create an asymmetry with respect to the parsing side.
It does, but you're performing a different operation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it would be a single method, right? We would take the source, we would take an optional item formatter probably, and then an optional cancellation token, right?
Yeah, I assume it would be source stream, like source destination delegate cancellation.
That's fair. I was doodling while we're talking, but now I can doodle live.
Yeah.
It's the type. So we wouldn't default the action if we wanted to overload it. Is the only thing. So I went ahead and included if we wanted
those last two would also have an optional cancellation token, right?
Yeah, I'm still working on the doodle.
Oh, okay, sorry. And they'd be static.
You and your wanting things to compile.
Doodle faster, doodle faster.
All the buttons?
That's a funny word.
Aha. So. No, I need to flip the sources and destinations on these, which is that.
And maybe I'm missing. Well, what does the item formatter do?
Yeah, I'm failing to parse the second overload.
That shouldn't be action. That should be func.
Should it? His delegate was void.
But it was taking something to write into.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would have to do something. Otherwise.
Oh,
what does
action's
it
the
do?
producey one. No, action's func to void, right? So this takes a T, and
And does what with it?
again, his delegate was void previously.
But it took an I buffer writer.
Oh no, it was a byte returning one. Okay. I copied the. Or I looked at the wrong thing when.
And then if we
Yeah,
did
that makes
that,
more sense now.
we'd want the second overload, I think, to be have T be first. The action should take T first.
Yep, source to destination.
Yeah.
And
if in the future we did want synchronous versions of these, we would copy all 3 lines, paste, change async enumerable to enumerable.
Yeah.
Yep.
Same with pipewriter.
So, can someone explain to me why I would want the buffer writer one?
We would oh, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
To avoid allocating the byte array.
We would construct that buffer writer in a way that we would have our own buffer that was reusable.
Yeah, I guess so. Why would the func not just take the stream as well?
We need to go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say, Eric pointed out that if there are any new lines in the data that's written, we can't just write it out like that. We have to basically escape those new lines. So we can't just forward the user's written data directly to the output stream. We have to look at it and manipulate it.
And then I guess the the byte array one is just more convenient than the buffer writer one. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can prune it down to just one or the other, but there had been the discussion of overloading, so I wanted to show what that would look like.
Could we, in the interest of avoiding more overloads being added in the future, would it be possible to not include the second overload and perhaps have a helper that converts the first one in terms of the other one? Like, is that
where the helper would take the return byte array and write it to an iBuffer writer? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. Which is, I haven't
Like
sketched it out, but I'm guessing it would be trivial as well.
Well, that's trivial, but you made the byte array in the meantime.
Yeah.
If you want the never create the intermediate byte array, then you need something different.
I mean, honestly, like, I don't even know that the second one is that convenient, because all you have to do is writer or item formatter dot write with whatever byte array that is, right? So, I mean,
I think
if
the
you only had
convenience
the
is
buffer writer
difference.
one,
I think the convenience is if you're serializing JSON, it's 1 line versus 2 lines, basically.
Yeah. I think we can get rid of the second one until we have evidence that,
yeah.
It's fine.
Sure. I mean, we can also propose it or leave it in the thing saying it's approved, and then you can just not implement it.
Fair.
Sure. I mean, the one way to do it.
It's a question of does he need to come back later for approval if he wants to add it. If it's approved already, then he doesn't. But yeah, I think that, so just showing the things. So if synchronous was wanted, then yeah, it would be drop those, and then drop those, and then drop the cancellation tokens, which aren't aligned, so I'm not going to remove them. And Ta-da. Do we need the to stream in the method? Like, do we expect we would be overloading or have complicated overloads that we need to make a distinction between I'm writing to a stream and I'm writing to a something else and not just let overload resolution deal with it? It feels like it's just write.
It's fair. What did we call it on SSC parser?
Let me check.
Probably parse. Maybe read. But
Yeah. The only place to have different operations is if you can't tell by the data, right? Like usually, like parse and load is often used because load is usually taking the string and interpreting it as a path and then loading a file. But if you're just dealing with streams, I think it's fine to just have read and write.
Yeah. On SSC parser, we called it an enumerate, and the source is passed into the constructor, so it's not quite a parallel. I think write is fine.
Yeah. Have we concluded we don't have the enumerable ones for now?
Yeah,
I think that
I
the main benefit would be if someone doesn't want to reference system link async for testing purposes, you can, well, not even for testing. If you just build up a list of T with all the things you want to output, you can pass that as an IEnumerable. You can't pass it as an async enumerable.
Right.
yes, but we are then mixing synchronous enumeration and synchronous stream writing.
Right, that one would just be a write method, but you probably still want to do the IO async. So,
Right,
I think we should just we should just
because write
focus on
async could take
link
non-async
link
enumerables, which would be do synchronous enumeration with asynchronous writing. The fourth one, which is async enumeration with synchronous writing, that's the one that doesn't make sense.
I think we should encourage using system link async. It's got a to async enumerable or as async enumerable or something like that. And if the lack of inboxness is problematic, we're looking at including it in 10. So
yeah, I think that's fine. Do we think that async enumerable of SSE item is effectively the exchange type for this? If so, would we want to make them extension methods over those?
extension methods.
no.
I think I want to know if we made them extension methods, we'd have to change the names to be like write SSE or something, because you need to know what you're writing. And but SSE item is already in the source. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an async enumerable of T, right? It's an async enumerable of SSE item.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. If we effectively say that's the representation for, a server-side event channel, then I don't think it's bad to have a write method directly off of it.
I don't know. Like for these types of, heavyweight operations, I would prefer to just call a static method. But that is just me. I can see how it might be convenient to, like, assuming you had system.link.async to be able to just, complete your chain with a write as SSC async or something like that. But at the same time, having that in my IntelliSense, I don't know. It's probably not my cup of tea, I guess.
I mean, to me, it highly depends on how standardized the format is. If it's just one of the many you can choose, or if it's the standard way of doing it, then it makes sense to have it like this. If it's not, then it doesn't, right? I mean, the benefit of a static method is you can support multiple formats.
As long as we don't change the name of the type to SSC format or extensions or something, adding this doesn't hurt the static syntax. It just also lets you use it as an extension method.
Yep, I guess that's fair. And we generally don't want extensions in the name anyway, so.
Indeed.
I don't feel strongly. To me, it's just like the type seems to be specific enough that to me it would make sense.
Yeah, I ag- I agree that it feels constrained enough that it's not confusing, and I don't know that the method needs more words in it if it's viewed from instance invocation syntax, because what other kinds of writing would you be doing on this high async enumerable?
Yeah.
So I think we can leave the this is that I doodled in there and it's totally fine, or we can be opinionated and say call it using static invocation, and if you want to make your own forwarding extension method so you can use the this syntax, then go for it. I don't care.
Okay.
So I think Mo
what
asked
was
for
the-
it and no one cared, so we'll leave it.
I mean,
What was
I
the
don't
decision on
care
the second one?
strongly.
Sorry.
It seems like Eric has a disdain for that, but it's just within the .NET ecosystem. Those are the kind of things where I think it would feel slightly more natural. But I'm not a user of this library, so I don't claim that I'm the customer here.
Would have we done these? And what would it be called? Write async as an extension method? If this were an instance method on async enumerable, would it be called write async or write to async? Because
I mean, I've seen both.
Yeah, so maybe it should be right to, because yeah, I don't know that we're actually clear on when we do right versus right to.
I mean, to me, it kind of seems like you're always effectively doing a write to because you always pass in the thing you want to write to. I don't know how else you would do it,
Except
right?
on stream
Right.
where you're saying I'm giving you the thing to write.
right, correct.
So
Other right.
so right to
Well, you already gave
Takes
it in
the
the
string.
constructor, but like that's yeah.
I'm trying to like we have write async today on stream that takes the thing to write and writes it to this.
Right.
What's on the screen isn't writing to this, it's writing to something else. And I'm wondering if we call those things something else. And if we do, then we probably shouldn't make this an extension method. If we don't, then it's fine.
or if we think that it should be called right to either way, then we can just add the
Well,
to.
as an extension, for the static use, to me that reads really strangely. That a right to have
Yeah.
a right to that
'Cause
takes the source.
Yeah, I feel like a right to always has a destination as the first parameter.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I think you will also find a write that just takes the destination as well. I don't think we're that consistent. Unfortunately, my machine is not very responsive right now, so I don't know what's going on here.
All right, sounds like there's slightly more hesitation to making them an extension method than there is preference to add them, so we can leave the this off.
We still want the second overload. And what was the verdict there?
I think we were getting rid of it. Second, not third.
Oh, you want to get rid of the byte array returning one?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought you meant the second overload that took a item formatter. So.
And I guess there was another point of contention that we were literally just having over the issue chat about the event type property, because, and I know like typically nullability annotations don't pertain to API review, but in a way, this is a breaking change because what we shipped has the event type as non-nullable, and the reason for that is per the spec, when you're parsing and you're reading an event that doesn't specify an event type in its payload, then you're supposed to just use the event type message, which is fine if you're reading data, but from the perspective of writing data, there's also the requirement that you might want to be able to influence how you actually format your events on the wire. So, if that property was made non-nullable, then that suggests that the formatter would always be producing an event type.
No, it can special case message, just like the parser special cases message.
Yeah. So I mean,
Yeah, but
if the only time you want to allow null, assuming the constructor is currently rejecting null, if the only time you want to allow null is when you give it event ID, just overload your constructor.
No, they're two separate things. This is not related to event ID.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Eric, your concern is that we're having to put policy into the formatter to choose whether either if event type comes back as message, we always write out message, or if event type comes back as message, the formatter is allowed to elide it.
Exactly. Like I think that the behavior that we have in the parser that is normalizing parsed events so that the event type is populated when you parse it, I think that's fine. What I think is kind of sketchy from my perspective is having some sort of logic saying that, oh, if the event type happens to be equal to this magic string that we have here, then do not emit it on the wire, skip it.
But if you don't do that, then the thing that you just said was fine. Someone reads if someone's a proxy, they read the events in, we put in message, they write them out. They're going to be outputting message every time because the formatter wouldn't be removing it.
Yeah, assuming that you're round tripping with the same implementation, right?
Assuming that you're round tripping with our methods, yeah.
You're just a relay.
But
I guess I don't know why. What is the situation where someone wants to force message to be included in the output?
I mean, my impression is that if you're explicitly specifying it, then a formatter is meant to present that in the wire format. Unless the specification explicitly states that valid SSC formatters should not be including the type message on the wire, and it should instead be skipped.
It doesn't have any opinion about whether they should or not. It says they can. But I understand the perspective. You're trying to say, like, we're going to take exactly the data you give us, and we're not going to enforce any opinions at all over how that data is written out. We're going to write it with no opinionation. What you give us is what we write.
Right, like if we're kind of adapting this type to be our view model for what we're actually outputting in the wire, right? I think it makes sense to be faithful to what is being specified.
But I don't understand why that opinion differs from. Why is it any different than the parser faithfully representing what came in?
I honestly, like, my only concern would be not making a breaking change, but I'd be happy to not hard coding the absence of event types with message. But like you said, this is something that is specified.
Yeah, and it actually, I mean, it is a breaking change. Like, changing that is whether or not you consider nullable annotations breaking changes. We would be taking something that used to return non-null, and it would actually return null.
Yeah.
So anyone dotting off of it would break.
Yeah. The question is, do we want to make it a behavioral breaking change as well on the parsing side? I don't think we need to take it to that extent. I think that some asymmetry between the formatter and the parser is permissible.
Yeah, I mean, if
It's
you want
just
to
adding
be
nullable here. It's just that adding, like the this property is primarily for the consumer of the parser, and making this nullable then says effectively that the parser is going to produce null.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
could make the constructor accept null. You can add a field instead of using auto property and make the property return message, and the formatter writes down what the field says. Some people may dislike the lack of purity between what the actual structure of the item is and what the properties say, but if you care about the ability to explicitly format out as null, then you can have the data in the item of whether or not it really said null or you just made it up.
It's true.
You don't have to make that public API.
I mean, sure.
Which would
the only
be
downside I see is that
question mark here and leave it not question mark here.
in the hypothetical scenario where a formatter explicitly specifies message as their event type parameter, then the effect of that would be that there would be no event type in the formatter, because it would be treating it equivalent
Why?
as having passed null.
No, I'm saying don't change. The formatter will write down whatever it's told to.
Hmm?
The parser,
Pulling it from the field.
if it sees no event, it will pass event type null here, and the property will return underscore event type question mark message. So the formatter is not going to read the property; it's going to read the field, and the
I see.
and the parser will represent the null it got or not. So
Yeah, I
a
mean,
proxy / relay would forward the implicit message type, event type, faithfully, and anybody reading it in code would see that it's a message.
I mean, it's a reasonable compromise. The only downside I see is that, people debugging this might have questions why there is an event type when inspecting the property, but somehow that doesn't materialize in what you're formatting.
Yeah, then
It
they can
does,
step
and
in the
then
code
just
and see the question mark.
Yeah, it's just that's no different from the formatter can choose to, if event type is returning message, the formatter might be choosing to elide it, even though it will respect what was provided as the field value. Seems like a pretty reasonable compromise to me.
Okay.
Bonus, it means that the existing annotation is always correct, even for default SSE item, which is not today.
It's not for default of SSE item of string. Sorry, it would be for
It's
event
not-
type, but the data property.
Right, I'm not talking about data, I'm talking
Okay.
about event type.
Yeah. All right, so we're leaving event type alone, and only saying the constructor now accepts null, and it will hide that from the property.
Seems like a reasonable compromise. And the event ID, making that a init, that's to avoid having to add another constructor.
Yeah, basically. And Safia did mention that she'd be interested in other fields as well, which means that we might have to revisit this before we ship.
What other fields?
I
I think
believe
the only
she-
other one missing is the date time stamp, right?
let me check. It might have been offline, so I'll check that and get back to you.
So if I remember correctly, the only other piece of information that can show up in an SSE item beyond the event ID is a last, like a refresh time or write time or something like that. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where did that window go? Event, data, ID, and retry.
Retry. That's what it was.
And otherwise, the field is ignored.
Okay. I would probably resist the temptation of designing a property for that right now.
Looks like it would be int.
Is it?
Except it's actually, but it's a. Yeah, it would be, but I don't remember what it represents. I thought it was a. Oh yeah, set the stream's reconnection time, so it's an int that represents some date time offset like thing. Or time span, maybe. Might be time span.
Yeah, I mean, time span might make sense. So fair enough.
But anyhow,
The
we can leave it off for now.
live representation and the wire don't have to be the same. So, all right. So we're leaving the property non-nullable. The CDOR will accept null, and we replaced instance SSE formatter with a static class. All right, so action of T to I, or action of T and I buffer writer. That's what we're happy with shipping.
Ship it.
All right, looks like we got through 4 of the 5 in only a 10-minute overrun. So,
Thank you.
so thanks everyone who had something to talk about, and thanks, I guess, to anyone who joined us, even though Mo suggested that you should be paying attention to .NET Conf instead of here. Yeah, we'll see everyone next Tuesday at our same .NET time here on our same .NET channel. And until then, auf Wiedersehen.
Thank you.
Bye.